So today's video is about a perfumer who must be constantly annoyed that we all get his name wrong. It's also somebody who created one of the best-selling men's fragrances of the 90s, starting off the metrosexual fragrance trend. Also somebody who had a huge hit with a fragrance that defined an entire new genre of fragrance. And finally, someone who has now become the creative director at Dior. Yes, it's Francis Kurkdjian. So if you've not seen me before, I'm Claire Smith. I make videos all about fragrance and I'm making a series of videos all about perfumers. I'm trying to profile their lives and their attitudes to fragrance and really talk about their most famous creations. So if you haven't already checked out the two other videos in this series, I've made videos about Quentin Biche already and also Dominique Ribignon. I'm going to leave those linked down below in the description box in case you do want to go check those out. But today's video is all about Francis Kurkdjian. So let's kick off with what people get wrong about him, including me up to this moment, and I'm still a little bit confused about how to pronounce his name. I've actually just gone and watched a video from his brand and listened to the name repeatedly, and they say it Francis Kurkdjian. And I have been pronouncing it wrong in every single video I have made throughout my lifetime on YouTube, 5 years. So I'm sure pretty much everybody else is also pronouncing it wrong. And for that, Francis, I apologise. So Francis was born in Paris in 1969, but the reason he has that unusual name is because he's of Armenian descent. He was born in Paris because his grandparents fled an Armenian genocide in 1922 and they came to France to find a new life. His interest in perfumery really grew out of being surrounded by fashion as he was growing up. His grandfathers were involved in supplying materials and in tailoring, and also his mother, Sylvia, was a skilled amateur seamstress. He describes her as being very fashionable, of altering her clothes to fit the season, to keep up with the latest trends, and he says that she wore Madame Rochus. And actually they would also go to worship in the Armenian church in Paris, which was just around the corner from the Avenue Montaigne, where the famous Dior boutique is located still. Francis says that as a child he memorised the locations of all the boutiques down that road. He was obsessed with the idea of couturiers. Reading about Francis Kurkdjian, the thing that really stands out is that he is someone who wants the best. He is someone who won't be second best. He wants to be the best. And that meant that he had a few changes in his life about what he wanted to do, because he didn't want to settle for something that wasn't the best. First off, he studied ballet and classical dance, and he actually applied to dance for the Paris Opera Ballet. He wanted to get a place at ballet school, and actually they turned him down twice. He says that he remembers reading a quotation by Victor Hugo, which said, "I will be Chateaubriand or nothing." I will be the best or nothing. So next, Francis dreamt of being a fashion designer, but he realised his drawing skills were not quite up to the mark. At 14, he read an article about the creator of YSL's Opium, and he also watched a film where a perfumer seduces Catherine Deneuve. And then he thought, that's it, that's what I want to be. He describes himself as a perfumer who accidentally became a perfumer. In 1985, at the age of 16, he wrote 2 letters. One was to Dior, the other was to Lancôme, to ask how he could become a perfumer. Ironically, it was Lancôme and not Dior that replied to him, and they suggested the perfumery school at Versailles. In 1990, at the age of 21, he took up his place at a perfumery school, and he says the first thing that he learnt was to inhale like a perfumer, fast and soft. He was also taught to identify thousands of ingredients solely by their scent. The thing about perfumery school that a lot of people overlook is that most people who go to perfumery school do not become perfumers for personal scents. They become perfumers for things like laundry detergents, shampoos, body care. Also, they become people who develop flavours for foods even. One of Kurkdjian's colleagues at perfumery school describes him as having l'amour de luxe, l'amour de beau. So a love of luxury, a love of beauty. And she says that she always knew that he was destined for something special. Francis graduated perfumery school at the age of 24 in 1993, and he went to work for a company called Quest International, So Quest International no longer exists as a standalone company. It's been absorbed into the Givaudan, larger fragrance conglomerate. Quest was quite big news. It had operations in 32 different countries. It was really a manufacturing base for fragrances, but also for flavourings. So it did a lot of different things. Really, this was a solid job, but it just wasn't what Francis wanted. To prove his worth as a perfumer when he first joined the company, he was asked to recreate a fragrance that was already on the market from scratch without any kind of analysis telling him what was in the fragrance. So not things like gas chromatography breakdowns, just by smell alone and his knowledge of ingredients, trying to recreate a fragrance. He chose to recreate Bulgari's HEVA. So HEVA is a fresh green tea fragrance. Is that sounding familiar? More on that later. Kurkdjian's version of this fragrance was so accurate that he was immediately apprenticed to the fine fragrance department. But actually, his first success did not come at Quest. It came from an encounter with someone from outside the company. So Francis's father, Miran, was a very wise bloke. He told Francis that he should get more qualifications. He couldn't rely on perfumery alone. So Miran suggested that he go for a marketing degree. So he paid for him to do evening classes at somewhere called Soup de Luxe. This was a marketing school for luxurious goods that was run by Cartier. Francis obtained his master's degree, and at the ceremony he met Chantal Rouge. She ran YSL's perfumery department. At the time, opium was marketed. She was one of the most powerful figures at the time in the world of designer perfumery. Rouge met Francis and exchanged business cards and told him to call her. A month later, their first meeting, she told him her company had recently gained control to the license to produce Jean Paul Gaultier's fragrances, and they were looking to produce a new male-marketed cologne. So this fragrance was meant to be something that was about the idea of a clean musk, of a clean-smelling sweat. An idea of sensuality, an idea that you want to bite into a man's skin. Something bright, fresh feeling, and maybe even a little bit retro. It was really all about a good-looking man taking good care of himself. Chantal told Francis to come back in 3 weeks with some samples. Francis took inspiration from old school fougères and modernised them. This fragrance was a musky, minty lavender fragrance, but it was modernised with hints of vanilla. Francis handed the samples to Rouge and figured that she would just give him some feedback, that it was a great learning experience, that he'd be up against the world's best perfumers and they were unlikely to choose his fragrance because he didn't have a track record. He didn't have success behind him. There was no reason for them to choose his fragrance other than how it smelt. To his surprise, 6 months later, the company that Rouge worked for launched his fragrance. They were launching it as Le Male. It was 1995, Francis was 25, nearly 26, and he had his first designer fragrance on the market. He'd beaten world-renowned perfumers at their own game. So we've already heard that Francis's colleague at Perfumery School said that he was a lover of luxury and a lover of beauty. We all have to admit that Jean Paul Gaultier bottles and also packaging is perhaps not the most sophisticated. It stands out on the market for sure, and it is very Jean Paul Gaultier, but it's not screaming to me luxury. So what did Francis think? Well, that bottle in the form of the anatomically correct torso with the bulges in the right places, along with that aluminium tin can that it comes in, was not what Francis had dreamt of. He says, "I thought it's not luxury. I wanted the beautifully crafted couture box with the gold writing." He needn't have worried though. The scent itself was immensely appreciated. It quickly became the best-selling men's fragrance across Europe. Le Male spoke to a whole new generation of people fed up with smelling like their dads. If you're around in the late 90s or even the early 2000s, Le Male was the pulsing scent of a club. It was everywhere. Francis says technically Le Male is not a difficult fragrance. He says that vanilla acts like a baggy jumper. It disguises faults in the rest of the fragrance. It's very forgiving. And he says that actually, had this been a more floral fragrance, he might have struggled. So what did this early success do for Francis? How did he feel about this? He felt pressured. He was worried about what he was going to create next and what people would think of it. But he also says that the success of Le Male was all about timing. He says 20 years later, 20 years earlier, Le Male would not have worked. So it's 1996. He's had one hit. It's not for the company that he works for. How do Quest react? So Quest International transferred him to their newly opened New York offices. They presented this as a promotion. But Francis thinks differently. He says, my colleagues were super jealous, so they sent me away. He arrived in New York as a French speaker, and it was something that he wasn't prepared for. He had to learn English quickly. Whilst he was in New York, he had some really surprising projects. So if you're around in the 1990s as a young woman, you might have experienced the smell of teenage boys. It wasn't good. But a deodorant called Lynx, or Axe if you're somewhere outside of the UK, came to women's rescue all over the globe and actually made teenage boys smell a hell of a lot better. And one of the fragrances in that range was called Apollo. So who was the perfumer? It was Francis Kurkdjian. Francis also developed a fragrance for Elizabeth Arden back in 1999. So he actually was the perfumer behind Elizabeth Arden's green tea fragrance. And that was inspired by the restaurant across the street from the offices of Quest where he would eat lunch. So it was actually a Japanese restaurant and they sold matcha ice cream, and that was what inspired Elizabeth Arden's green tea. Francis says that he didn't like working in America. He felt the marketing department guided where fragrances were going, and he didn't enjoy that. He felt like he should be freer. He felt like he should just get some inspiration and be allowed to play. But he was always being told, oh, in Boston there's this particular socioeconomic group and they play tennis, so can you make a fragrance for that group? That's what he didn't like. He ended up threatening Quest and saying that he was going to quit unless he got moved back to Paris. In 2000, he got his wish. He moved back to Paris and he changed his role so that he could take on more private clients and gain more experience by fulfilling more briefs outside of Quest International. In 2001, Francis was awarded the Prix François Coty, which is basically a fragrance Oscar. It's given to the person who's made the biggest contribution to fragrance. There's only one person gifted this award per year, and it's awarded by a jury of people who've already got the award, so a panel of perfumers in the industry. So in 2003, Francis Kurkdjian worked with Christine Nagel, and they produced a fragrance for the Narciso Rodriguez brand. Narciso Rodriguez was somebody who wore Egyptian musk, and he wanted a fragrance that smelt basically like the fragrance that he wore. And this fragrance had been gifted to him by one of his very best friends who sadly had been killed in an accident back in 1999. So that friend was Carolyn Bessette Kennedy. And she wore this Egyptian musk, and actually Narciso was so enraptured with it that she actually gifted her fragrance to him so that he could wear it too. And that's where the idea behind Narciso Rodriguez's for her EDT came from. This fragrance had a very minimalistic aesthetic. It bucked the trend for fragrance at the time, and it was actually bottled in a black bottle, which again was really unheard of for female marketed fragrances at the time. They generally weren't packaged in black. So this fragrance really did stand out. It was very different. It was very much a your skin kind of fragrance, a nude fragrance almost. Perfume was an enormous success, and actually Francis went on to create the EDP fragrance as well of that line, and we're still getting flankers today. He clearly did a great job with Christine Nagel back in 2003 when he made that original EDT. If you want to find out more about the ideas behind that for her EDT fragrance, I have a video on that and I'll link it down below in the description box in case you do want to go check that out. But for now, I'm going to leave that one and move on because we have a lot of fragrances to talk about. So in 2004, Francis went to work for Dior. This was a lifetime's dream achieved, and it would foreshadow what would happen to him later on in life. So Dior had just launched a Privé line, and they wanted an initial release of a few fragrances for this new Privé line. The Privé line was really an antidote to the growing niche market that was really beginning to challenge higher-end designer offerings. Dior had to up their game. Francis produced two fragrances. So the first was Cologne Blanche and the second was Eau Noire. So Eau Noire was a really striking creation. I really like the combination of the coffee, the lavender and the licorice. Very distinctive, very loud, very big. I think at one point these fragrances got discontinued, but I think they're back in the Dior range now. I think Eau Noir got relaunched, and I'm not sure whether Cologne Blanche also got relaunched. But anyway, Kurkdjian was once asked what he thought about those fragrances being discontinued. And this is what he said. "I'm sad about discontinuations because they mean I failed. Eau Noir was maybe too dramatic. I don't even know why Dior discontinued Cologne Blanche. Maybe it was not saleable. They're gone. I'm sad. I'm sad for the consumer. I'm sad about Eau Noir because to me it was one of the greats." So eventually Francis did move away from Quest International and he went to work for a Japanese firm called Takasago. So at Takasago he worked as a consultant. So he wasn't really there full time. He took more time to himself to work for his private clients. And it was at this point he began to do big art installation types of fragrances. So for example, he recreated the fragrance of Marie Antoinette for the Palace of Versailles back in 2006. Also, he recreated the fragrance of an old dollar bill alongside an artist for another installation. He even accepted private commissions. So for example, Catherine Deneuve had a fragrance that was discontinued and she wanted him to recreate it. And he would do this for private clients, charging quite a lot of money for a personalised service. And actually all of these art projects paid off because in 2008, Francis Kurkdjian was actually awarded a Chevalier des Arts and des Lettres from the French government. So this is basically a type of knighthood where you're given an award for increasing the value of French culture across the world. So basically for his services to perfumery, I feel like that's what he got this award for. So bigger things still lay ahead for Francis. The early 2000s had heralded the rise of niche perfumery. Frédéric Malle had launched his brand in 2000, where he'd featured the names of perfumers on the fronts of the bottles of Perfume. It was a new way of thinking about fragrance, where the perfumer was the star. Coupled with social media and also the rise of review sites like Fragrantica, it was becoming more of a thing to be into fragrance in a big way. This also polarised the market. At one end, you had the celebrity fragrances being pumped out in the early 2000s, the rise of the idea of a fragrance as fast fashion, more and more releases per year. At the other end, you had the rise of the new niche exclusive brand, and soon to be Maison Francis Kurkdjian. So in 2009, that's what Francis did. He founded the brand alongside his friend Mark Shire, his business partner, who he credits with a lot of success for that company. I think the striking thing that I've read about Francis forming this brand was that Francis' father, Miran, actually warned him not to use Kurkdjian as the name of the fragrance. He didn't think that it could be a famous name. Miran actually didn't use his name in public. He preferred to be called Pierre because people found it easier to say. And similarly with his second name, he'd actually dropped the second K to make it easier for people who weren't of Armenian origin to say. Francis listened to his advice but just told him gently that he was wrong. And he went ahead and named his fragrance company Maison Francis Kurkdjian. Francis used his connections at Takasago to manufacture his own fragrances. And he launched with a small suite of fragrances. Some were easier, like Aqua Universalis. Some were more challenging. So Francis credits a lot of the brand's financial success and obviously its continued existence to his business partner, Mark. He says that the brand was profitable in an amazingly short period of only 2 years. So for example, Victoria Beckham's brand, her fashion brand and her perfumery brand, it took her 17 years to make that business profitable. And of course, that's a slightly different area, it's fashion, but still, I think that really marks just how successful the financial management of that company was. So meanwhile, Francis continued to build his brand whilst working for designers, producing designer fragrances. In 2011, he created another classic. This is actually one of my favourites of his creations. It's something that is very, very strong and that I sometimes get a headache with, but I can see that it's a very striking, very well executed fragrance, and I think it's an amazing fragrance for something that's on the designer market. This one is Elie Saab's Le Parfum. So this fragrance is based around the brand owner's idea of his childhood. So he is Lebanese and he grew up near Beirut, and he says that the breeze was scented with orange blossoms. And because the tree of Lebanon is the cedar tree, there is cedar in the base of this fragrance. But this is just a beautiful honeyed white floral fragrance, and it has rose as well, and also just that nice woody base. A really stunningly beautiful fragrance that was entirely guided by the idea of luminosity, and really the use of the solar florals in this fragrance is what gives it that luminosity. It's got a brightness to it. So yeah, stunning fragrance, Le Parfum. So 2013 was a big year for Francis. Francis had again his second lightning bolt streak of luck. So in 2013, he was approached by Baccarat, the glass company, to produce a fragrance for their 250th anniversary. When a journalist asked Francis what the brief was for the original fragrance, Francis replied, "They said something like, 'We need a fragrance, can you help us out?'" So for Baccarat, Francis designed 3 samples, and he just wasn't happy with them. He just didn't think they fitted the idea of what he wanted. He wanted something luxurious and something luminous, and what he'd done was he'd based 3 of these fragrances around fragrances that were available 250 years ago to try and reflect Baccarat's history. And it was just a moment of doubt that made him open a drawer in his desk. This drawer was where he kept all of the fragrances that he created that he just didn't think fitted the brief or had been rejected by brands that he still felt were really good fragrances. And he picked up a vial named HEVA. HEVA had been an experimental fragrance. Francis had been trying to create a new type of gourmand. Something that was sweet without being foody. Something that had presence, something that was expansive, something that was clean but also luxurious. It was a more abstract and more artisanal type of gourmand fragrance. So HEVA is actually an acronym. So H stands for Hédione. So Hédione is a jasmine-like fragrance, entirely synthetic, that acts as an amplifier in fragrances, but it also is something that activates a particular pheromone receptor. And it's really pretty much the only molecule that is proven to have some kind of effect on arousal, particularly in females. The E stood for Evanile, so that provided a mossy kind of smell, again a synthetic. The V was Veltol. So Veltol is in the same realms as things like ethyl maltol, the fragrance note that is used in a smaller dose in fragrances like Angel. It's that cotton candy kind of sweetness. Finally, the A of HEVA stood for Ambroxan. So Ambroxan is a replacement for ambergris. So in a few countries around the world, I think the US and also Australia, despite ambergris being a product that you don't have to kill a whale for, ambergris itself is banned from use in those countries. And that's because there's the thought that people could misunderstand where you get ambergris from and could intentionally kill whales in order to try and obtain that ingredient because it's so expensive. So that, and also the immense cost of ambergris, which I think is actually more expensive per weight than things like gold, that is why Ambroxan was created. It's lighter, it's fresher, and it's used in a lot of fragrances, again, to create a kind of fresh presence. Interestingly, Francis actually says that he tried to sell HEVA to a number of other fragrance brands, and they all turned him down. And you just wonder who these brands were and really how much they're kicking themselves now. So autumn 2014, Baccarat released their fragrance, Rouge 540. So this was in a limited edition run. And these fragrances were in this really expensive Baccarat crystal bottle. They retailed for €3,000 each. And they sold out really quickly, mainly to collectors of Baccarat glass. Rouge 540 is named both after the type of crystal and also the temperature of the furnace used to create the crystal. And actually, Francis had a small amount of the fragrance and he gifted it to the vice president of the beauty department at Neiman Marcus, a department store, a high-end department store in the US. She was called Kelly St. John, and she started wearing this fragrance, and she just said that she had a really strange experience in which people were coming up to her and saying, "What are you wearing? How can I get this?" People just kept telling her how good she smelt. She had people stopping her in lifts. It just struck her that people loved this fragrance. They loved the trail this fragrance left. It had a good projection, and she wanted to stock it in her department store. She told Francis that if he could make more of this fragrance, she would sell it at Neiman Marcus. Kurkdjian had a problem. He'd made a limited edition run exclusively for Baccarat. What was he going to do? He had to talk to them. They finally agreed to let him use the fragrance and to market it in his own bottles under his own label, but he called it Baccarat Rouge 540 to reflect where it had come from. And the rest is history. Baccarat Rouge 540 is one of the best-selling luxury fragrances of all time. And it took a while to get going. I remember even people who had never dropped that kind of money on niche fragrance before suddenly became interested in buying a fragrance like Baccarat Rouge 540. It had some kind of weird mind control power over people. To some people, BR 540 is obnoxious. To others, it's amazing. And to others still, it's something that they just can't smell. And people claim that they're anosmic to the components. My friend John once said to me, this is not a fragrance for a ninja. And that totally reflects how I feel about the fragrance. It's something that's so loud, it's so present, it's got an enormous trail. You can smell it for days. I've got a little vial of the X-Stray. If I even move that vial, if I even just pick it up, I can smell it in my room for 3 or 4 days. It's not even opened, and I can smell it. Effectively, Baccarat Rouge 540 set a new level of expectation for what a fragrance could do. So a new level of expectation for projection and sillage. So the problem with having a hit fragrance is that it gets copied. Francis Kurkdjian actually is quoted as saying that the fragrance industry has no morals when it comes to copying other people's work. But he also says that he does not focus on his work being copied. He focuses on creating the next Rouge 540. So I feel the peak for Baccarat Rouge 540 was around the pandemic. I feel like social media had a big part to play in its gaining popularity, and also the rise of other fragrances cloning that fragrance. So, for example, the advent of fragrances like Ariana Grande's Cloud actually had a weird knock-on effect of popularising the idea of the original fragrance Baccarat Rouge 540. So just for time reasons, I'm not going to detail the entirety of the MFK back catalogue, but needless to say they had lots of hits, so things like Eau Rose, also things like the Gentle Fluidity fragrances. There are many other fragrances to check out, but another one I would like to mention would be Grand Soir. So next, let's go back to the designer offerings that Francis was still creating while he was growing his brand. So back in 2014, he went to work for Burberry. So in 2014, he produced My Burberry. So My Burberry is a bright but sour, fruity floral patchouli fragrance. It's got quince in it, and I really feel like this is very much of Francis's style. Francis actually says that he enjoyed working for Burberry much more than other brands. He says he has a really good relationship with Burberry, and I think actually his work for Burberry is probably the closest that we're actually getting for his work for his own brand. In 2015, he started working on Nina Ricci fragrances, and the first fragrance that he produced was L'Extase. I actually love the L'Extase range, but I don't have the original. I have the Absolute version, which is actually widely compared to the Oud Mood kind of fragrances. And there's also Chant d'Extase, which is a kind of salty caramel fragrance with a lot of fruitiness and a kind of sea breeze feel to it. Really interesting fragrance and incredibly affordable, this line as well. So in 2016, he also worked for Kenzo, and he produced a fragrance called Kenzo World. So Kenzo World is actually one of my favourite fragrances, and it's something technically on paper I definitely should not like. So this fragrance is an ethereal, enveloping, fruity floral fragrance, but with an overdose of ambroxan. Again, this fragrance has signature elements of his style, so it has an almost crystalline feel. It's very clear feeling kind of fragrance. I love this one, but I can see that not everybody will love this one, but it's something that I feel has a different type of feel to everything else I've smelt. So in 2018, Francis also worked for Lolita Lempicka, where he produced Lolita Land, and he also went back to work for Burberry, where he created Burberry Her. So Burberry Her is really something that reminds us of Baccarat Rouge 540. It's got that kind of construction to it, but it's got a fruitier top. It's slightly plasticky even. It's a very interesting fragrance. Again, I think this reflects Francis's love of working for Burberry. The fact that he's willing to make fragrances very much along the same lines as the fragrances that he would make for MFK is very telling to me. So meanwhile, he's been building this brand. He's doing really well. MFK have immense growth thanks to Baccarat Rouge 540 and other successful fragrances. And LVMH have been sniffing around since 2015. They've had an offer on the table, and Francis and Mark have been trying to decide for the last 2 years. It's now 2017. And they finally say, okay, LVMH, we're going to sell. So they make an agreement, and they make the agreement that Francis will stay as the creative director of MFK. And Francis says that he was hesitant when he was making this deal. But actually, he says it's taken the pressure off, and he's appreciated the backing of a huge conglomerate brand like LVMH. So 3 years down the line, it's late 2020, and there are rumours going around that Dior are losing Francois Dumarche as creative director. He wants to retire, and they're looking around for someone new to replace him. Francis gets a phone call from Dior. His heart sinks. Dior tell him that actually they've just appointed another perfumer, and they're ringing to ask what Francis thinks of their choice. Francis says, I remember that phone call just like I remember where I was when Princess Diana died. When I read that, I really felt for him, because it just must be so awful, mustn't it? The job you've always wanted is now being kind of paraded in front of you, but you haven't got it. That must make you feel terrible. I was really surprised. You know, who were they offering the job to? I don't know who that other perfumer was. If anybody out there knows who Dior had in mind, I would love to know. So Francis, you know, he's always trying to be the best, and he's always very driven. He sent a 4-line email to Dior a few weeks later. Just said, look, I'm your man. I can do this, but I'm going to keep creative control of MFK, and I'm going to work for Dior as well. And it's going to work. So in October 2021, Francis began his role as creative director at Dior Parfum. And he says that he demarks where he's working by how he dresses. So if he's working for Dior, he wears black. If he's working for MFK, he wears white. I really feel like he's had a bit of criticism while he's been at Dior. But from my point of view, I think actually his creations have been really quite good on the female marketed line. And it's definitely something that previous artistic directors at Dior have done. If you think about the number of reformulations of Miss Dior, for example, over the last 20 years, you will see he's not unusual in the fact that he's reformulating fragrances. But I think with his male marketed fragrances, the changes so far have not been well received. So how does Francis see the perfume industry? How does he think it's changed over the time that he's been working within it? So the first thing he points out is that the fragrance industry is more regulated, and that perfume companies are under umbrella brands now more often than they were. And what he means by that is the conglomerates, so for example LVMH, also Estee Lauder, for example, they work with particular producers of fragrance and flavours. So he says that's limiting, because unless you're working for one of those big brands like Givaudan, IFF, Firmenich or Symrise, you are not going to get a look in. You're not going to have the possibility of developing a fragrance for that brand. And if you think back to how he got to be the perfumer for Le Male, it was chance. It wasn't working for one of those big companies like Givaudan, etc. And he says that wouldn't happen today. The second thing that he points out is that there's bigger influence of commerciality and marketing. So he says the way to stand out as a young perfumer today is to have a big social media following, because brands will notice that, and that will in turn lead into point 3. So the point 3 that he says about perfumery is that brands want someone who's a bankable perfumer. So they want someone with a long track record of successful fragrances, who can talk to the media, who looks good on a camera, who can express themselves, who can talk about the fragrance itself, who can bring across a story and can add to the value of the fragrance. Francis also says that perfumery itself has changed over those 30 years, and he describes fragrances as becoming more sugary and even more greasy feeling. He says it reflects people's changing tastes in food and how we've become more unhealthy as a world. And really that unhealthiness has spilt over into the world of perfumery. People want sweeter, they want milkier, they want more delicious, more gourmand. So finally, what have I learnt about Francis? Well, I've learnt that he loves luxury. I've learnt that second is not good enough for Francis. And I've also learnt that he believes in the importance of timing. So a journalist once asked Francis, how long did it take you to make Baccarat Rouge 540? And he didn't answer days. He didn't answer weeks, he didn't answer months, he didn't answer about the time it took him to formulate the fragrance. His answer was 20 years. And that's because Francis believes that it's the sum of his career. It's every moment leading up to that moment was what enabled him to take those risks, to push those boundaries, to create that whole new genre of fragrance with just one scent. So I've really enjoyed reading about Francis Kurkdjian. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I found him absolutely fascinating to research, and I could have talked for many more hours on him because he's just had such an exciting time in the world of perfumery. Please, if you have liked this video, please give me a big thumbs up, and also please consider subscribing if you don't want to miss out on any more of these Perfumer profile series of videos. I am really enjoying making them, even though they do take me a very long time, and I will make more of them. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.